The blueprint lay folded on the table, edges creased from months of being opened, studied, and refolded. Its blue lines told a story of promise. Affordable housing units in the heart of the city, a chance for families who'd been waiting years on lists that never seemed to move. For David Carter, owner of Carter & Sons Construction, this contract wasn't just a job, it was validation. Proof that his company, Black-owned, family-built from the ground up, could stand toe-to-toe with the biggest firms in the state. David had spent nearly 2 decades building his reputation, starting with small repair jobs, patching roofs, fixing sidewalks, rehabbing old duplexes no one else would touch. His crew was small but loyal, men and women from the same neighborhoods where the projects went up. Their hands were rough, their backs strong, their faith steady. And when the city finally opened bidding for the new housing development on the east side, David knew this was his shot. The competition was fierce. $1-million firms with entire departments dedicated to writing bids. But David had done his homework. He knew the costs down to the nails, knew how to cut waste without cutting safety. For weeks, he sat at his dining table, running numbers, highlighting supply chains, negotiating with subcontractors who trusted his word more than any glossy brochure. When he submitted his bid, he prayed over it. Not just for himself, but for every worker he employed, child who needed a safe home, for the chance to show the city what could be built when they invested in the people who lived there. Weeks later, the letter arrived. Carter & Sons had won. The announcement made headlines. City awards historic contract to minority-owned firm. Reporters came out to the office, snapping photos of David standing proudly with his team. Local politicians shook his hand, promising support. For once, the spotlight felt warm instead of harsh. But as David would soon learn, the applause was short-lived. Because in this city, contracts didn't always mean opportunity. Sometimes they meant war. The first signs were small. A permit that usually took 3 days to process dragged on for 3 weeks. When David called City Hall, the clerk sighed into the phone. "We're a little backed up. You'll just have to wait your turn." But David had contacts, and he knew that another company, a larger, white-owned firm, had its permits approved in 2 days flat. Next came the supply chain. Materials he'd secured months in advance were suddenly delayed. Lumber shipments rerouted, steel beams mysteriously missing from the manifest. His suppliers swore they'd sent them, but the paperwork at the docks told a different story. Each delay cost money. Each missing shipment pushed deadlines. And then came the inspections. The city inspector showed up unannounced, clipboard in hand, looking for faults. A railing was an inch too low, a bolt not flush enough. Minor issues that normally earned a warning suddenly became violations. David's crew fixed them in hours, but the inspector wrote them up anyway, filing reports that slowed approvals. It wasn't incompetence, it was sabotage. David's ally in all this was Rosa Martinez, the project manager he'd hired after years of working side by side on smaller builds. Rosa had a sharp mind and a sharper tongue, never afraid to challenge nonsense. She kept meticulous records, dates, times, discrepancies. "They're setting us up," she whispered one night as they sat in the trailer, surrounded by paperwork. "They don't want us to finish. They want us to fail so they can say we weren't ready for a contract this size." David rubbed his forehead, exhaustion etched into his skin. "But we're not failing. We're doing everything right." Rosa looked at him with pity. "That doesn't matter if the system decides you're already wrong." Meanwhile, in the neighborhood where the units were rising, families watched with hope. Parents brought their kids by after school, pointing at the skeleton frames of the buildings. "That's where we might live," one little girl said, clutching her mother's hand. David heard those words, and they fueled him. He refused to let sabotage steal what those families had been promised. But behind closed doors, city officials were already whispering. One of those whispers reached Aaron Blake, a mid-level employee at City Hall. He'd worked there 10 years, long enough to see patterns. Which firms got fast-tracked? Which ones got buried under lost paperwork? He'd seen minority-owned companies win bids only to be strangled with red tape until they backed out. And he'd seen the same handful of major firms swoop in afterward to rescue the project. It was a cycle, and a profitable one. Aaron wasn't supposed to care. He had a mortgage, kids, a pension to think about. But when he read the internal emails about Carter and Sons, mocking them, calling them rookies, plotting how to stall inspections, something in him snapped. He'd grown up not far from the East Side. He remembered watching his own parents struggle to find housing that wasn't falling apart. He remembered promises that never came true. And now, seeing this company try to do right, only to be targeted, he couldn't keep quiet. One night, Aaron slipped an envelope into Rosa's hand outside a coffee shop. Inside were copies of emails, memos, and notes. Proof. "This is what you're up against," he said quietly. "Don't say my name. Don't even hint you know me." Rosa nodded, her heart pounding. She knew this was dynamite. With Aaron's documents, the picture became clear. City officials were colluding with larger firms, deliberately undermining Carter and Sons. Every delay, every missing shipment, every citation was part of a strategy. They wanted David to default so they could reassign the contract. Rosa showed David the evidence. His hands shook as he read. Rage burned through him, but so did resolve. "Then we fight. We don't fold." The fight took many forms. Rosa began leaking pieces of the story to local journalists she trusted. David started speaking at community meetings, telling residents what was happening. Families rallied, pastors preached, activists showed up at the site with signs, "Let Carter build." For the first time, the city's strategy was exposed to the public. Cameras captured the faces of the workers, the families who wanted homes, the injustice of it all. But exposure comes at a cost. David started receiving anonymous calls. "You're making a mistake. Drop the contract." His office was vandalized, windows smashed, subcontractors were pressured to walk away. Marcus from church, who'd supplied plumbing for years, shook his head with regret. "They told me if I keep working with you, I'll lose every city job I got. I can't risk it, David." It cut deep. But David couldn't blame him. The system thrived on fear. The breaking point came when the city officially suspended Carter and Sons from the project, citing failure to meet deadlines. They called a press conference, smiling for cameras, announcing that a more experienced firm would take over to ensure the housing was completed. David stood outside the site gates that night, the blueprint in his hands. Creased, marked with red ink from inspectors, coffee stains from late nights. He stared at it, torn between despair and defiance. Rosa stood beside him. "This isn't the end. Not if we make it public." And public they made it. The leaked emails hit the news. Headlines blared, city accused of rigging contracts against minority firms. Community leaders called for investigations. Civil rights groups filed complaints. David testified before the city council, his voice steady even as his hands shook. He held up the blueprint. "This is more than paper. This is proof that we can build, that we can deliver." But we were never given a fair chance. Not because of skill, not because of performance, but because of who we are. The room was silent when he finished. Cameras clicked. The city officials shifted uncomfortably. The legal battle dragged on for months. The city denied wrongdoing, blamed miscommunication, promised reforms. But the evidence spoke louder. Eventually, under pressure, the federal government opened a review into discriminatory contracting practices. The result wasn't sweeping justice. Carter and Sons didn't get the project back. The larger firm finished the build, cutting corners David never would have allowed. But the investigation forced the city to overhaul its contracting policies, implement oversight, and pay a settlement to Carter and Sons. It wasn't the victory they dreamed of, but it wasn't defeat either. David used the settlement to keep his company alive. They took smaller jobs, kept their crew employed, refused to fold. And in the neighborhood, families moved into the new housing units, homes built on the bones of a fight they never saw, but one that had secured them a roof nonetheless. Maya, one of Angela's daughters, came to volunteer with the Tenants Association there. She met David one afternoon, shook his hand, and thanked him. "People don't always see what you sacrificed, but we do." David smiled, tired but proud. "We just kept building. That's what we do." Years later, the blueprint still sat in his office, framed now, creased edges visible, red ink still bleeding across the lines. A reminder, not of what was lost, but of what was fought for. Because sometimes justice doesn't come in full, sometimes it limps, sometimes it crawls. But it comes when people refuse to fold, when they hold up the blueprint and say, "This is what we were promised, and we're not letting go." And as long as stories like David's are told, as long as voices rise against the silence, then maybe, just maybe, the next blueprint won't be stained with sabotage, but signed with hope.